God, be in my mouth and in my speaking, be in our ears and in our hearing, be in our hearts that we might feel your will and do it. We ask this in your name. Amen. Well, today's lessons feature a God who loves to be with people where they live, and about how we get to entertain angels and even God without being aware of it until after the fact. Like, who was that masked man? That was the Lone Ranger, you know? Both Genesis and Luke hold that hospitality to the stranger is the hallmark of any person or any society claiming to be civilized followers of the God that we meet in the lives of Abraham or Jesus. The culture of the Mediterranean, the culture of the Bible is a Mediterranean culture. If you have Jewish or Egyptian or Italian or Spanish or French or Greek or Moroccan friends or relatives, you know about the amazing welcome made over you when you show up, even unannounced. The same is true in the USA among our Mexican or Italian friends and neighbors. They seem happy that you show up and still happier if you bring a guest with you. Those of us who are Northern Europeans and those from the British Isles, not so much. Remember the film, My Big Fat Greek Wedding? The difference between the bride's large, boisterous Greek family showing up to make a party and the groom's parents from Connecticut arriving with a bundt cake expecting a quiet little gathering among the parents. Culturally, Northern Europeans tend to set a date for when we will be receiving visitors. We have a guest list, and some of us live in neighborhoods with a gate, and the guard even has a list of the people's names we're expecting. We may have place cards to show where the invited guests are invited to sit. When our church's spiritual ancestors, the Mayflower Pilgrims, planned a Thanksgiving feast to celebrate that barely half their number had made it through that first New England winter. What we used to say in Boston is 6 months of horrible weather, and then comes winter. So they invited 4 or 5 of the Native American leaders to the celebration because it was the indigenous peoples who had taught us how and what to plant in that unforgiving climate and that rocky soil. Well, sometimes social norms can make for miscommunication. The whole indigenous village showed up to the feast, assuming that all would be invited, because in the culture of the Indians, like the culture of the Mediterranean, it is inconceivable to hold a party that wasn't for everyone. Our spiritual ancestors, the Pilgrims, panicked because, as we wasps know, 100 or 200 extra guests for dinner can really put a strain on the planned menu and the budget. New England culture also tends to have a specified arrival and departure time. Please join us for cocktails at 6. We will dine and party from 7 to 10. And at 9:55, the guests of New Englanders look at their watches and head out the door. Imagine our surprise to find that our Native American neighbors not only believed that nobody in the village could be excluded, but also that for a gathering considered to be a feast, the sun has to rise and set 3 times.
Oh my God.
Well, the food ran out within hours. Our Congregationalist great whatever grandparents were mortified at their obvious failure of their first Thanksgiving feast. The Native American guests couldn't figure out why they were so anxious, telling us, like Jesus told Martha, "You're fretting and fussing about so many things." They let us know that the old days were over. The old days of want. that 6 months where 5 kernels of corn a day per person were over. We now had friends. And they were going to show us a new life. And so they simply reorganized that party to turn it into a hunting and fishing party. And they showed us how to hunt the wild turkeys in the thick forest, how to track the deer, and they showed us where to find the mussels and the oysters and the clams at the beach. That Thanksgiving feast that was supposed to be for 50 plus 4 guests and to last a few hours turned out to be a feast for over 200 people, where the guests outnumbered the hosts 3 to 1 and turned that first meager, first Congregationalist potluck on the continent into a party that was absolutely amazing. Not only for the guests, but for the hosts. The fellowship created by that joint hosting and hunting trip was strong. Hospitality coupled with fellowship changes everything. Strangers become friends. The Wampanoag tribe welcomed our ancestors, undocumented refugees that they were, escaping England's king via another country, Holland, though they did. And they taught us everything we knew about how to survive. They not only welcomed us, they showed us how to live, how to survive, because they knew we were all in this together. You see, God was in these parts before the Mayflower people got here. The Plymouth folks wrote that God had sent the Indians to help them. The treaty between the Plymouth Pilgrims and the Wampanoag lasted for more than 50 years. 25 times longer than our recent agreement with Iran, because the Pilgrims stayed at the table. Our Boston cousins, the Puritans, never had a treaty with the Native Americans that lasted longer than a few years, because they first labeled the people, those whose land that they were taking, as savages, and then continuously broke the treaties that they had made with them. We must own that they too are our spiritual ancestors. And one Native American chief recently observed, how can anyone possibly describe as an illegal immigrant? How can anyone be described as an illegal immigrant on stolen land?
Yeah.
Well, what's that got to do with today's scriptures? Everything. Everything. In both of today's scriptures are about hospitality. The hosts welcomed God into their lives in human form. The principal doctrine of the Christian faith is the doctrine of the incarnation, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world. That the spiritual is to be found in the material. The spiritual we always find in the physical, in the material. Jesus tells us that that was what was true of him, that God's Spirit was in him, is true of all people and all creation. That God is even present with the sparrow when it falls. That God is even in the wild flowers of the field that a human being never sees. The psalmist says, if I go to the ends of the earth, Lord, you're there. Even if I make my bed in hell, you are there. Thomas Aquinas loved to say, there's not a spot where God is not. There's not a spot where God is not. God is in the guest, and God is in the host. Hospitality together with fellowship can change everything. A fearful God can become a friend. Abraham, 100-year-old desert rat, a cradle robber living in a tent with his Sarah, his 90-year-old bride, and her maid, Hagar, by whom Abraham had sired the son Ishmael. Those people that want to talk about biblical family values. Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Abraham was in his tent when he saw 3 strangers appearing. And 100-year-old Abram ran to greet them and to welcome them into his home. God's law to all desert dwellers was hospitality, especially the strangers and foreigners in that hostile climate, because without hospitality, people perish in the desert. It still is happening. The text says that as they approached, the old man ran out and bowed down to the ground to welcome them. And most of us here, many of us here, are not spring chickens. Perhaps you're more limber than I, but bowing down to the ground on a good day would be a big deal. And getting up again, given gravity and all that, would be another story. But like our Mediterranean neighbors, Father Abraham rolls out the red carpet. He asks if they would please stay so that their feet might be washed and cooled, and that they might accept, the Hebrew says, just a morsel to eat. They agree, and like the Greek papa or Jewish mother, Abraham goes into high gear. Just a morsel indeed, not in my tent. To a servant boy he says, butcher and cook that calf. We've got company to feed, and be quick about it. To 90-year-old Sarah, take 3 measures of our best meal and knead it and make cake. It's party time. And importantly, the text says that as the people are being served, the 3 are being served, Abraham stays with them. Abraham stays with them, taking care of them while they're eating, probably asking questions about them and their place of origin and their trip. Hospitality is about giving yourself, not just the food and the refreshment. And it's about receiving from your guests that the life of God that they bring to the table, you know? Throughout the biblical period, it was a Jewish and Roman custom that the men and women ate separately. The Mediterranean cursed us with patriarchy as surely as it blessed us with the notion of hospitality. Sarah was as curious as Abraham was about the guests. She wanted to be at the party, and she was as close as her society would permit, in the woman's tent, listening at the tent flap to everything that was being said with her good ear. She wanted to be part of that party as much as her husband did. In genuine hospitality, we are as present as possible to our guests. When we're there with them, we can expect our world to be enlarged by those who bear God in their bodies and souls differently from the way that God is in us. God says that the childless Sarah will bear a son within a year, and name him Isaac. Well, at that, 90-year-old Sarah just loses it, and she laughs. The Hebrew says she laughs out loud. I'm well past menopause, and that wizened old husband of mine, we're going to make a baby? To a couple who has been considering whether to move to Sun City or a senior living facility, instead being told by a stranger that they need to build a nursery. And God asks, the first time the stranger is identified as God, asks, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for God? In patriarchy, women's husbands are frequently asked questions as if the woman wasn't there. You're having steak, what will she have? You know. Sarah is fearful. She hears in the tent, so she lies from behind the tent flap, saying, I didn't laugh. And God said, oh yes, you did too laugh. And 2 chapters earlier, when a voice came to Abraham saying he was going to be a father, He laughed so hard he fell on the ground. So here we are, the mother and father of faith, laughing out loud at the thought that God, their creator, the creator of the universe, if you would visit or count on them, as old and as useless as they felt at that point. The question asked of them, why are you laughing? Is anything too difficult for God? How is it with your soul today? Are there ever times in your life when you feel beyond God's Spirit and beyond God's presence, or that your usefulness at this point is questionable, if not completely past? So God and the angels head out, and Sarah and Abraham look at each other and they say the Hebrew equivalent of, well, honey, if we're going to be parents, we're not getting any younger. And with a wink, they move into the tent, and Scripture has it that within the year, the baby is born, and God had said to call him Isaac. And you know what Isaac means. Laughter. God has the last laugh. Sarah and Abraham received God in the strangers, not because their faith was so strong, but because they made themselves present to the strangers that they were hosting. One of my favorite quotes of Julian of Norwich, she writes, "The person who loves everything and everyone God made, the person who loves everything and everyone that God made loves God, because God is in every person. God is in all things." Every religion includes mystics who have come to that same conclusion. The physical contains the spiritual. God is in you, and God is in me. Only when we're really present and open to receiving God are we likely to see God in the people around us. Martha invites Jesus into her home and immediately goes into high gear to make him welcome. Sister Mary welcomes Jesus as a guest and pays attention to him and listens to him, what God has to teach to her, to show her, to tell her through this encounter with Jesus. Martha is doing what's expected of her as in a patriarchal culture. She's either cooking or cleaning or setting the table or doing the laundry or doing the things that she's supposed to do. And she comes not to Mary, but to Jesus and says, "Master, don't you care that my sister," and she can't even name her at this point, she's so mad, "that my sister is abandoned all the work to me?" Spoken with Velcro applied to the wrist and the forehead. "Don't you care?" You know? And Jesus responds, "Martha, Martha, Martha, you're worrying and you're fretting. You have anxiety about many things." In the Message translation, you're getting yourself worked up over nothing. Only one thing is necessary, and Mary's chosen it. It's the main course. Don't take it from her. Mary was being a disciple. She was listening to Jesus. She was listening to what God might have to tell her through Jesus. She was doing something that is forbidden in patriarchy. She was being a disciple. And Jesus said that patriarchy no longer applies. Paul says no longer slave nor free, male nor female. You know? Jesus isn't forbidding hospitality. He's saying, don't let the work of hospitality get in the way of the biggest part of hospitality, which is being present with your guest. Have you ever been to somebody's house where they're so dedicated to making you welcome that they don't have time to talk to you? Of course you have. This is church, right? You tell the truth here. In Luke's gospel, Jesus keeps telling the disciples and the Pharisees and the leaders and the people that life is short. And that makes it important to keep things in balance, to keep our priorities about what is most important. And the top priority is God's presence with you in this world. It isn't about meeting God when you die. It's right here, right now, in things as simple as bread and wine, as the water of your baptism, the water you drink, and the water in which you swim. In the beauty of the flowers and the cactus, and in the wren that lives in the cactus, and in all the birds that sing just for you. God is in that independent cat of yours that sometimes will let you sit in your own favorite chair and sometimes won't. God is in the love of that dog that greets you at the door as if you've been gone a lifetime and as if you've been a saint since he last saw you. Even on days that you've been your worst self to the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and the supermarket clerk and the barista. The top priority in our lives needs to be that there's not a spot where God is not. Always being ready to meet God where we are. That God is in this very room, now. I love it when Rev Kev says, look around you, because I always get to see God in so many faces. You know? And the people who, God is in the people who set this room up for you this morning. And the people who printed your bulletins, and the people who put them together, and the people who play the piano for you, the people who taught them how to play. And then the people who brought the food for the fellowship after the service today. The main thing is that whatever you've been fretting about and anxious about all week long, you're here this morning. And you're with God in many faces. God who is here among us and within us. And in one another. And those we've known since Jesus was doing carpentry work, and those we just met today. Of course it's important to prepare meals. They don't cook themselves. Music doesn't just happen. Sermons don't just appear. Hymns just don't appear. But Jesus isn't scolding Martha for her work. He's telling her that while she's fussing a meal to impress him, he would have been happier with a tuna fish sandwich, because he wouldn't have been missing her. And he wouldn't have been missing the way that God is in her. The main thing is that when our guests have arrived, when we're together, that we're not fretting about what's wrong or what's not done or what's missing or what have I forgotten, but that we're fully present, just as God is fully present to us all the time. The biggest, most important welcome that you and I can give any person is to be fully present with them and to look for God in them. So, if God is already in everybody, why do we need to have faith? Well, you know, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. So we do both. We spend time with Jesus and we listen to him. It's not just that we like to have the presence of God or the presence of Jesus with us, but we want to be like him. That's where the faith comes in. We're not just hosting God. We want to become like God. We want to become more loving of others rather than judging of others. And that takes all the faith that I've got. I don't know about you. For Christians, the church isn't a museum for saints, but a laboratory of learning how to love God and how to love God in others and God in ourselves, even on the days when I know you will find this hard to believe, but sometimes even church people cannot be nice. That they can be difficult. And sometimes I'm not very nice. My friend Luz Wiesminde liked to say, I look for the Christ in everyone, but sometimes you give me eye strain. And if I may say so, I'll bet there are times that you're not your sweetest self either. And this is church, right? I can tell the truth here. But I don't leave you and I don't throw you out, because God is still in you and God is still in me. Those of you who are working with folks at Our Lady of Soledad, with the refugees seeking to find a new and a safe home among us, you have met God in those people. Those amazing people who have walked 1,000 miles and who have been so meanly and dishonestly characterized by some of our leaders. They are not criminals. God is in them. You know that to be true. You meet God when you make and you serve the sandwiches at the shelter, when you give bags of dog and cat food to those people who would rather go without food themselves than see their pets hungry, because they know God is there too. It's because we listen to Jesus that we know our purpose in life is to love God with all our hearts and minds and soul and strength, and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And it's because we listen to Jesus that we're committed to looking for God and listening for God in every person. And it's because we listen to Jesus that we know that God is with all those people being put in jails and in camps and who are seeking freedom and life. And that God is with all those children being put in those cages. And because God is in them, you and I, as old as we are, will continue to work to get them out. Many of us may be almost as old as Sarah and Abraham, but God is in us. Like Mary and Martha in their day, we're people without a great deal of societal or political clout, but we are among those who believe that the physical contains the spiritual. The human and natural world are filled with God. Jesus says the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the universe is in us and in all people. It's both and. If we listen to Jesus, by faith, we ask God to make us like him. And like Martha and Abraham, we take the actions we believe he calls us to take. We may not be powerful, but trusting in God's presence and love for all people, we will not be intimidated in our service of God in other people, regardless of our age or our race or our gender or our ability or sexuality or our gender identity or our economic status or our country of origin or the status of our citizenship. In our work for justice, we will work for justice and fairness, because God is in all. God is all and in all. Old Abraham and Sarah became the parents of a great nation. Several great nations. Martha and Mary became agents in raising Lazarus from the dead and keeping the ministry of Jesus alive when he left us physically. And because God is real and present in the physical in us, you and I are a force to be reckoned with. I look for the God in you, and there God is. I look in your eyes, and I see the eyes of God looking back at me. I listen to your voice, and I hear God speaking to me. That's enough. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen. Please rise as you are able, and we'll sing the hymn of response that's printed in the insert in your bulletin. Martha labored in the kitchen.